Hola, people. Surf Dog here. Actually, King Kong. Welcome to, I think it's our first CISO Roundtable, CISO Summit of highly important people who are CISOs and talk to that community. We're talking today with several experts in the field of cybersecurity at the leadership level. We have Jeff Roberts from Principia Array. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, Principia is close enough.
Okay, there you go. And then Matt Kunkel, of CEO of LogicGate. You can say hi, Matt.
How you doing?
And of course, the illustrious Andrzej himself.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah. So I think we have a list of questions that we're going to pepper you with, but feel free to add any nuggets of value that you think the leadership of organizations tasked with cybersecurity need to hear. The first one we'll kind of throw out there is, how would you define the organizational ecosystem in context of cybersecurity? Who wants to go first?
I'll take it. Kick us off here.
Okay.
All right. So I would define it as probably the interconnectivity between the network of people, technology, data, and processes that you have in an organization to help your digital operations and help your cybersecurity posture, right? And I think there's a lot that goes into that. There's a couple key components. First is the information and data assets that you have. So how do you know what those critical assets are, how to protect your financial records, how to protect your intellectual property in them? Second is one that's near and dear, I'm sure, to all of our hearts, which is just networking infrastructure, routers, switches, firewalls, things like that. Third is endpoints and devices, computers, your networks, your smartphones, your IoT. I think this is a big target for breaches and malware right now. Application security on the different applications that we use in our organizations, whether those are our own internal homegrown applications or third-party applications. Cloud infrastructure, I think, is a big one, right? Especially as 95% of all organizations are moving primarily to the cloud. And then I think a couple just ending ones are employees and people, end users. That is the weakest link when you think about a cybersecurity program, is your people. So how do we have the proper awareness, the proper training, the proper controls in place? Third parties is a big part of our cybersecurity footprint and that ecosystem. Most companies nowadays work with a large conglomerate of third parties. And I would say outside of just the people aspect is probably the second highest attack vector that cybersecurity professional or cybersecurity hackers go after. And then in my world, you got to have policies, protocols to put in place to make sure that people have guidance in all of this. You've got to have detection and monitoring for it. And then there's the compliance landscape and the regulatory landscape that fits above all of this, right? So I think all of these things work in tandem to create an organization's cybersecurity ecosystem, and they have to work in tandem to mitigate the overall risk vectors and threats and minimize incidences that happen within organizations.
Funny you mentioned risk vectors. Was it an organization recently that actually counted employees as assets? So that's kind of weird, because it's an asset that can talk back. And that can think.
Also, it's your most important asset too.
They can think analytically. I mean, most of the stuff that you listed is just kind of like a machine, input output. But when you get humans involved, it complicates things. And then you also brought in risk vectors. How are we approaching the ecosystem with everything that's in it? Like, traditionally it seems like we have vendors going after a specific problem in cybersecurity, but they're not embracing the underworld or the hackers. I mean, we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. And so I think it's interesting that you include that in the list of the ecosystem. Yeah, you're sleeping with these people.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I like Matt's answer, but I will also kind of build on not so much what is the ecosystem, but to your point, Craig, how has it changed, right? There is no traditional ecosystem anymore. The days of here are my endpoints and here's my server closet in this defined space down at the end of a building, those days are gone, right? The stretching of the boundaries to include mobile access to all data from anywhere to anything that is just the reality of today's world, and the demand for most commercial businesses has stretched those boundaries to the point that what was easier in the past to secure is no longer the same. It's not the same problem to solve. To Matt's point, the supply chain risk that you're introducing with third-party vendors and hybrid cloud tools and the types of solutions that are required to enable today's business make that a bigger challenge. I think an angle that we often look at this from is, let's get back to what are you securing and why are you securing it, right? What are the assets you're concerned about securing? What is that data and what is driving the requirement? Are you a government contractor with a contractual obligation to protect data? Are you in the healthcare vertical with an obligation to protect patient data and PII? Are you a commercial enterprise trying to protect your intellectual property for business reasons? So starting from the context of where is the risk, what is the data, allows you to better define what is your boundary as a business, because traditionally those boundaries are not what they once were.
I couldn't agree with that more, Jeff. I mean, literally, I work with customers that spend gobs of time, effort, energy, resources protecting something that I was like, well, what happens if an actual hacker gets this? What is the value to them of it? And what is the downside to the business if this happens? And they're like, nah, it's minimal. I was like, well, why are we spending time, effort, and energy on it, right? You got to, first of all, identify what are those crown jewel assets that if this gets out into the world, it's a billion dollar problem, right? And then you spend the time, effort, and energy in there, because let's face it, in the world that we live in, and especially today, everyone is resource constrained. The narrative out there in especially the public markets is profitability, right? If you're a CEO, profitability now is, balanced with growth, obviously, is where everyone is heading, which means everyone, including places that were traditionally kind of off limits from cost cutting, i.e. the security departments, the CISO departments, they're under scrutiny these days. So we got to act, we got to be more efficient with how we deploy resources.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Which is why everybody needs to be using vaulting to encrypt their data.
Craig, I'd like to add a couple of things, and if you don't mind, I'd like to share a couple of slides that perhaps give the audience a bit of a framework to think about it and put some of these things in perspective.
I'm pretty sure your slides are better looking than us. So
yeah. Well, I don't know about that, but let's just see if that's going to work.
You should be able to share.
Okay. Let me know if you can see it.
I cannot. What's going on there? Oh, here we go. I have to add you. Here it is.
Okay.
Wow, look at that.
So I would, and actually I'm going to skip ahead for a second to perhaps go back into what Matt and Jeff were just talking about, because there is this whole concept of how do we think about the overall organizational cybersecurity? Yes. So we look at it from the perspective of, right, you've got organizational cybersecurity, of which obviously enterprise tech cybersecurity, network cybersecurity, et cetera, are a very, very large part. And that's sort of, if you look at this graphic, we'll go through it in a second, that's this entire white space area that's absolutely major. Obviously, CyberNation Central focuses on both sides of this equation, but we'll go through the left side because it is an under-focused part, and yet that's the part that's actually now bringing so many cyber criminals to the market of cybercrime and taking our organizations ransom, et cetera. So we think of it as, yes, organization cybersecurity, of which the overarching part that the CISO really currently is the de facto CEO of it's not only organizational cybersecurity, but as part of that enterprise tech cybersecurity. And again, that is mostly the CISOs, CTOs, CIOs, CSOs, whatever your role in the organization is, that's their job. But as part of that is people cybersecurity. And we've got this noted as an outsized space because whatever statistics you look at, whether it's IBM or Verizon or whoever, right, north of 50%, and in fact, statistics say north of 70% of cyber breaches are caused through human error. So people cybersecurity becomes very important, which is why a focus on that, whether you are a startup or a publicly listed company, becomes very important. And so obviously, as part of that is this idea of general employee cybersecurity, board and executive cybersecurity, which really includes general employee cybersecurity, but is so much bigger and more risky than most organizations give it credit to. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, throughout this hour. And then obviously third-party cybersecurity, as Matt already mentioned. And we generally say board and executive-facing cyber threats are bigger and more serious than general employee-facing ones, simply because boards and C-suites are obviously a conduit that has access to everything in the organization. All right, think about it. You've got access to literally the keys to the kingdom, if you will. And so that's generally how we like to think about it. And we do show board threats as outsized, not because board directors have that much more access than an executive to the organization. They don't. But generally, they are less and least prepared to deal with any cyber attack on them specifically than an executive might be. And an executive is generally still, to this day, in an average organization, less prepared to deal with cyber threats against them than an average employee is, not because they're not going through the same frontline level employee training that a frontline employee does, but because they generally do not spend as much time, because they don't have it, on their own cyber acuity, cyber awareness, cyber training, understanding of the risks, et cetera, et cetera. And so that said, when you look at overall people cybersecurity, you have to all of a sudden start looking at professional cybersecurity as an executive, as a frontline employee, et cetera, versus your personal and family cybersecurity, because obviously those are now starting to really affect the organization, right? You're working from home, so on and so forth.
So are you saying that every executive in leadership of every organization needs to be cyber aware?
Not just cyber aware, but cyber ready, right? What are the threats? And this is, in our world,
I mentioned that because I know, especially in the small, medium business space, and I can point to an organization that, I mean, they absolutely have no clue that this exists.
That's right. And I know the audience of this webcast is varied, but I'll just give my example. I came out of investment banking, UBS Tech and defense investment banking. I launched a company out of Hong Kong, grew it across 25 countries, faced a cyber attack and a disinformation campaign that disintegrated our company into nothing. And we were sophisticated. We had all this cybersecure tech. We had a great CTO at a time when CISOs didn't really exist still, or yet. And so when we peeled back the onion, we said, it wasn't about tech. It wasn't about not having a CISO or CTO. It was about a culture of cybersecurity. And so when you look at the CISO's job versus the people job, and therefore the board and C-suite oversight job, it is quite important. And I won't belabor this, aside from saying the organization doesn't really cybersecure you individually fully, not because they aren't trying to, but because your CISO cannot behave cybersecurity for you. You have to do that, right? Secondly, in your personal and family life, your CISO cannot do anything. And yet those risks affect the organization. So you as an executive and a board director have to be cyber aware, and you need to cultivate that kind of a culture in the organization. Cyber insurance, I won't belabor because that's not an answer to anything. And so you've got this professional, personal, and family side. And across each of those areas, you've got to mind that, we call it cyber avatar, cyber profile, whatever you call it, right? And that's kind of this, and I think Matt or Jeff spoke about this idea of You've got to mind your devices. You've got to mind your cloud security. You've got to mind your social media, passwords of authentication, travel as simple as from office to home, globally, et cetera, et cetera. And then across each of those pieces of your cyber profile, across professional, personal, and family lives, you've got to mind your general risks, so frontline employee risks, and your much more outsized executive risks. On top of which, you've got to mind your cybersecurity behaviors and cybersecurity technologies and their best practices with them. And then, right, and then you've got to mind, you've got your own personal devices, professional devices, family devices, juxtaposed against personal behaviors and devices of everything else. So that's how we think of it.
So let's add, wow, this just got scary. So let's add my family, my kids, my extended family into the ecosystem.
Yeah.
That's just fucking crazy right there.
And so to that point, and I forget whether it was Matt or Jeff who mentioned it, if I'm the CEO, I don't care if it's a startup or a publicly listed company, I need every single one of my employees to be a partner to the CISO. So if the CISO is doing their job, great. But if the CISO is amazing, if our technologies are amazing, and people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it doesn't matter how wonderful the CISO is. And so we need to start with assessing our self-threats, right? What threats are we facing? Then mastering that individual cybersecurity. Only then, as a board director or C-suite executive, can I sit at the table and say, what should my cyber governance strategy be? What should my geopolitical cyber response strategy be? What should my regulatory cyber response strategy be? And then last, cyber insurance, because it doesn't really do much. And so then everybody living that blueprint of cybersecurity.
You're saying that this is what the CEO needs to think about?
This is what the board and C-suite need to think about. And yes, it needs to be a culture that is driven by the CEO. Absolutely.
Executives are going to be earning their pay now.
Think about it.
So this is a tall order. I'm sorry. Matt, Jeff, what your thoughts on this?
I mean, all of the thoughts. I don't want to co-opt our agenda here, Craig, but there's a related question that we were going to get into a little bit later that I think may be the opportune time to jump into now, right? We're going to talk about, Andrzej really focused on how do we establish that strong cybersecurity culture within the ecosystem, ensuring that security is embedded. And we work with companies so many times that face that culture problem. And I could not agree more with Andrzej's description, right? This starts at the top, and where there's a clear understanding of the risk and requirements, typically at the IT leadership level, but not necessarily at the C level. That's where most of the problems happen. I don't think any of us would spend a lot of time speaking to IT leaders that aren't engaged, that don't know where the risks are, that don't understand the requirements. Where there's a disconnect culturally is typically between that IT layer and at the C level. And companies that do take this seriously, either because they have contractual obligations as a government contractor, or maybe because they're a commercial organization who's been through a breach and survived, those companies tend to have the strongest security-focused culture, because the survival of their business and revenue depends on building and maintaining that culture. I think where we see it falling apart is companies that, unfortunately, it's terrible to say, if you've been through a breach and survived, you're in good shape, but that's a very clear example. Or where your revenue is contractually tied to proving that you're doing all these cybersecurity things, those companies are in good shape. I think the rest of the ecosystem in general, to Andrzej's point, doesn't take this seriously enough. The challenge is taking those examples and spreading them across the ecosystem. It's difficult, right? Culture change is hard. Without the drive from the top, from the C level, and from that engagement, it doesn't work. You have to have the leadership embracing it. I think no company today should be without a chief information security officer. Frankly, even if it's just a fractional role, right? If you need 10% combined,
what if the CEO disappears and it's now a CEO CISO? of sorts?
You could argue where it should live in the org chart. Personally, and from experience, I don't think you should give, oh, well, hey, the COO is the guy on the board who's the most technical. Let's give him this responsibility. Or our CFO really knows what she's doing and she used to work in IT. Let's give her that responsibility. That's typically where this falls apart, right? It needs to be owned. It needs to be embraced. And the culture change absolutely has to start at that top layer. Ensuring that you've got engaged leadership is what is going to make the difference from getting through an incident successfully to a material company impact.
You've highlighted a big problem, like, because, NIST 800-171, that's going to force a lot of, hey, I'm a steel worker, I just make steel, right? They're going to be forced into this compliance thing. What do we do about the rest of the industry, like the other 90%?
Well, here's
How do
the
you make
thing,
them aware?
which is it's an education thing, because at the C level,
Awareness.
at the board level, what do they care about and what do they think about? Everything is dollars and cents, and everything is risk reward trade-offs to them, right? So we can't be talking to these CEOs and these board members about, hey, we got X vulnerabilities and we got X threat vectors coming in. That just goes well over their head, and it's just they tune out in 30 seconds.
Bingo.
Got to bring it back to, if we don't do this, we lose X billions of dollars. If we don't do this, the likelihood that our reputation gets tarnished is X%, because then you can put it into things that our little CEO minds can understand, which is, I need to make a call here. And that's what CEOs get paid for. They get paid to make calls. And the call, listen, if there were no risk rewards in business, everyone would have a business and everyone would be going through the moon, right? That's what business is about. It's about making trade-offs. Like, and I tell some people, I'm like, hey, if you work for XYZ healthcare agency and you don't want to be HIPAA compliant, that is a trade-off that you are making to A, lose a bunch of business, or B, get huge fines on that. And you have to make that decision for yourself on what is the best thing to do for the business. And oh, by the way, it's not free. It's going to cost you time, energy, effort, and resources to get HIPAA compliant to do that, right? But when you're a baby startup, maybe it's like, hey, I just need the customers first. Now, some customers might not even go with you unless you're HIPAA compliant, but I need the customers first to then justify the spend to get there and grow over time, right? So I totally agree that it starts at the top and it's a culture of security. And if you've gone through a breach, that's just ingrained throughout the entire organization, because you know it. But the big thing for me is, how do we change the narrative and how do we change the education process from our technical folks and our CISOs talking to boards and C-level executives about putting it in business context, not technical context, but if we don't do this, it will cost this, and make them make the trades. Our job is to educate and give them the data to make the most informed decision possible. And then the CEO and the board's job is to make those trade-offs and those decisions.
Matt, what I would add there is, so we just did a full hour-long RSA panel in April on how to build a culture of cybersecurity from the board down, where we really went through step by step what boards and C-suite should be doing and why. But I'll just share a couple of things. Can you see my screen?
Here we go. Here it is.
Okay.
Hold on.
So when we speak to CEOs and board chairs especially, right, there are a couple of things to know. Back to Matt's point, right? It's all about ROI. Cybercrime is now the third largest economy in the world. Cool. What's more important is it's growing, right, fast. 15% is annual growth rate, but our cybersecurity market is growing at 9.7. So that means we're constantly propagating a gap that's growing between our ability to respond versus cyber criminals. Not to belabor that point, average cost of breach in the US, Canada, UK, top 3 markets is growing. So if I'm a CEO, I'm thinking, what are we doing to be on the right side of that curve? All right, great. Another example, healthcare is, for the 12th year in a row, the highest average cost of breach industry. And yet it's one of the highest blinky lights full industries out there, right? A lot of technology that's not saving us, quite the opposite. And so you're seeing the average cost of breach grow in healthcare. And if you're in one of these lower tiers, if you will, consumer, retail, whatever it is, don't think that you're getting scot-free. It just means that hackers have not caught up to you because they've been able to monetize elsewhere. And we probably all know on this call how much a hacker makes, right? The average hacker makes, what, north of 200K. A manager may make 2 million. This is lucrative, right? Back to these numbers, a $10.5 trillion cybercrime economy by 2025, bigger than the US and Chinese GDP. So that said, why is this idea of a CISO CEO not quite the right fit? Back to Craig's question. Well, because when you're really looking at cyber attack impact factors, you've got a lot of things that a CISO, that's not the CISO's job, it's not the CISO's expertise. You've got loss of customer value relationships, loss of contract revenue, right? Impact of operational disruption, increased cost to raise capital, right? These are issues that involve the chief legal officer, the chief risk officer, the CFO, the COO. So unless there's singular thinking that's decentralized, right? So we propagate this idea of you can no longer centralize cybersecurity around the CISO. You've got to start decentralizing it into the hands of every executive that needs to be involved. That includes the board. And so when you're looking at, right, so if I'm the CEO, I'm then saying, all right, cool, so you're telling me that cybercrime is a large industry, it's growing. But what is the real average probability of breach to begin with? I don't care if you're even looking at 2018, 2019 numbers from IBM's cost of data breach. Even if you're looking at 30% chance of breach in the next 2 years, that's high, okay? So just put that in perspective, right? If you're listening to us, put this in perspective. 30%, right? 37.5 this year, but let's say 30% chance of being breached in the next 2 years. Well, if you look at these average cost of breaches, what that really translates to for your board today, right now, is a 2023 probability adjusted cost of breach that you're actually on the hook for paying in the next 12 months of 1.8 for an average industry, 2.1 in healthcare. And so what this really means is if I'm a board director, I know that we've just tripped our contingent liability reporting measures to disclose a $1.8 million contingent liability on our books. That's a real issue. And then if you're telling me that most of these breaches are caused not by cybersecurity technologies, but by behaviors, and therefore not my CISO's problem, but everybody's problem, starting with the CEO and chairman down, well, now you're starting to look at this issue of it's culture, stupid. And so the challenge, as Matt, I think, mentioned earlier, is boards and C-suites aren't trained and yet have to be, and they have to realize that cybersecurity is an issue of behaviors, tech innovation, strategy innovation, geopolitics, compliance, cyber insurance, and individual roles and responsibilities, not just fiduciary roles that will keep you regulatorily compliant, but tactical responsibilities that will actually allow you to be breach deterrent. I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, I mean, I think, thank you for that. You just did my risk quantification calculation for me. I've been searching endlessly for a simple calculation, and there it is. How do we create? It all goes into the culture of the organization. I mean, it starts at the top, but then has to permeate down. I mean, how do we do that? How do we build this culture within organizations, Jeff?
I mean, I think that speaks to the previous discussion around really driving it from the top level down. Without that leadership engagement, it is simply not going to happen. Again, Andrzej's highlighting what does that risk, how do you enumerate it? What does the math look like? And he's absolutely right. But frankly, it gets worse, right? So we spend at Principia Raid a fair amount of our time working with companies in the defense supply chain to help them manage this risk and close these gaps. And that's more based on our previous aerospace and defense careers. So that's our target market, and our deep expertise comes out of that arena. Well, the cost of an average breach in that market has grown in the past 3 years from, Andrzej's talking about 1.8. Well, defense supply chain risk baseline 2 years ago at about 3.5, and this year it's 6.1 to 6.2. So you're talking about a real number risk that is frankly going to put some of these businesses out of business. Just dealing with a breach of that nature is absolutely not realistic. And tying it back, Craig, you mentioned NIST 800-171 as a framework and the reality of meeting those requirements. Well, the reason that there's so much focus today, again, I'm going to use, the defense supply chain sounds like a pretty pointy niche, but it's not. There's about 300,000 companies in the US estimated who haven't dealt with these issues as small suppliers into suppliers of defense contracts. So if you've got the company down the street that makes plastic bags and they sell those plastic bags to Lockheed because Lockheed puts a circuit board in them and then sends it to another supplier, that smaller company is implicated. So the defense supply chain as a concept has grown so dramatically. Where I'm going with this is the whole concept behind NIST 800-171 as a standard for these organizations. When you read it, it's the list of what you should all be doing anyway. And enforcing it is where the DoD has focused on the cybersecurity maturity model certification that is pending. But the idea is this list of things that everyone should be doing anyway, and some companies like defense contractors are contractually obligated to do. So many companies aren't doing what they should already be doing. So you tie the whole thing back to culture. It's got to start at the top, but it's clearly understood what the behaviors should be. It's about enforcing that culture change from the top and driving that through the business, frankly, regardless of the vertical. Some companies should tighten the screws a little tighter, but you want to tell me that somebody in healthcare or the company down the street that sells those plastic bags, you're telling me they shouldn't be using multi-factor authentication because it's just not that important to them? Of course they should. It's the right thing to do. It's driving that understanding from the C-level all the way through the business that you can enable functionality. Obviously, you can't break the business, but come on, people, these are some ridiculously basic behaviors that need to be trained and reinforced and driven. It is not that complicated. It's not cheap to do it right, but we're not talking about rocket science. Even when dealing with companies that make rockets, it's not complicated. Do the right things.
And I think, and Matt, we're going to come back to you with a risk question, but we have a question from the field. Seems like there's really no end to how much you can build up your controls against cybersecurity risk, or maybe you can address risk here. In general, where should you draw the line between clearly adding value by maturing your controls and diminishing returns for those efforts? Ooh, that's a good one.
Well, I think it goes a couple things on that. One is, what is the business value? We're not just putting controls in place to put controls in place. What is the business value to put these controls in place? Are we getting into a new market like government where we need to be FedRAMP certified, right? Or DoD certified? Or do we have a new product line that we need, that we're now selling software, so we need to be SOC compliant and have controls? Are we getting into EMEA where they only take an ISO certification, right? So it starts with, what is the business need for the control set that we want to put in place, not just putting in a control set in place to secure ourselves, right? The other thing, the comment that I want to make here is, we are kidding ourselves if we think that our company is not going to have a breach. You just saw the data at some point in time in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It's inevitable, right? Every single CISO I talk to is not if we will be breached, it's when we will be breached, right? And it goes back to the conversation that we were having around understanding what matters. If I have a breach and someone gets, an email, internal correspondence talking about a dinner, probably am not too worried about that. If I have a breach and someone gets my customer assets that are tied to vulnerabilities, that are tied to threat vectors, that's a much bigger problem, right? So again, goes down to where I see the CISO's real kind of core main responsibility is they're the gatekeepers of what I call what matters. Where is the data that matters in the organization? How important would that data be to a hacker? And what are we doing to put the controls, the policies, the system controls, the processes in place to make sure that they don't get that? Because some of these huge, I mean, the big multi-trillion billion dollar industries out there, they've got too much. It would be impossible for them to secure all of the assets, all of the endpoints that they have. So you got to yoke it down to a spot where they're like, okay, this is manageable. And also it's cost effective, because that's ultimately what they then need to go present to the board, the CEO, and the rest of the executive committee is, team, this is the money that I need to secure the most valuable assets that we have in our organization to mitigate against X dollar exposure. And oh, by the way, I'm not talking about securing all this other stuff here. You know, this would be good for a next step, but it doesn't protect us in the magnitude that it would if we secure the top stuff.
Maybe a simple risk calculation would just include data and the cost to protect it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do, right? So LogicGate provides that, which is, how do you do, first we call it an IT risk assessment. What are the assets? What is the data that's in those assets? Giving those assets a score. What are the risk vectors? So, you know, whether they use Tenable or Rapid7 or CrowdStrike or whatever, what are the risk threats that go against those? Bump those up together, and then put that into a risk registry where they can then look at it. And then what you want to do is you want to do something called risk quantification on top of that. You know, there's a whole set of methodologies. The one we use is just a FAIR methodology, which is Monte Carlo simulations, to then say, okay, if I put X controls in place, my dollar exposure is Y without the controls. My dollar exposure is X with the controls. So you make it a really easy business decision for budget holders in the CFO and the CEO as to say, hey, we should do this because we're lowering the risk. We should put these resources into the company to get this, to put these mitigation steps in place because we're getting this reduction in risk exposure that we have.
Yeah.
Craig, I would just add to that, back to how do you empower the C-suite and individual board directors to get engaged? It's not just about data and measuring the risk of data. It's now about the CFO to really go through every line of the financial statement from a hacker's perspective and ask, how can a hacker go after this line item and cost me whatever? It's about the chief legal officer going through the iceberg picture that I showed you earlier of above surface costs and beneath surface costs, where actually the numbers that I quoted, the 1.8 million, the 2.1 million, those are really just the above surface costs. The beneath surface costs like loss of IP, loss of customers, loss of contracts, those are, Deloitte came out with a wonderful study that quotes that cost to be up to 30 times larger than the cost of the above the surface costs like responding to a breach, a PR campaign, legal campaign to clean up the breach, etc. And so when I'm the CEO, I'm saying to myself, I need to look at what would losing these customers really cost me over a 5-year period if I don't do what I need to do on protecting the IP, protecting the data, protecting our employees, training them, training our board, etc.
Yeah. So it kind of leads into, you know, if I'm listening to this cast, what are the challenges and opportunities that are out there for a small business or whatever to secure their ecosystem? This massive ball of everybody, that's this big snowball that keeps collecting people and assets, and now my family.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kick that one off. I think that it's a world of opportunity, but keep in mind, to Matt's point, it still starts with what is the business reason, okay? I think one of the recommendations that we work with all kinds of C-levels, we work with all kinds of IT teams, and when we talk about, I'm going to tie this back to our culture discussion, there's often a disconnect, and sometimes it's because the C-level isn't appreciating the IT risk, and we talked about the IT leadership in general and the IT teams They know what the risk is. They know they've got their technical estate sorted out. They understand the IT side of things. We always advise, I can tell you broadly, IT teams and IT leaders and IT practitioners can help close that gap. It's an opportunity for the IT teams to spend more time trying to think like the C-level. Stop thinking in only technical terms and think about governance, risk, and compliance. Think about these things so you're better prepared to have the conversations when you're talking about why do I need to spend this much money on this tool? Think about it from a business risk perspective and put yourself in that, a CEO or COO's seat. Don't say, well, this is going to do this technical thing. Say, no, this is going to help mitigate what is currently $2 million worth of risk. Oh, and the tool is 100K and you're going to prevent me a $2 million loss. Great. Don't just say, well, it's going to let me make multi-factor authentication work better for the group of engineers over here. So I think there's an opportunity for the IT teams to think more clearly about governance, risk, and compliance in general. But I think get help is something else that we always come back to. Managing the combination of tools to keep you as secure as possible used to be easier to do yourself. In today's more challenging threat environment, companies that do try to do it in-house, frankly, are often out of their league. Until you are a Boeing or a company of that size and can build the internal function to properly do this, the business case is just not there anymore to try to handle all of your security challenges internally. It simply doesn't make sense. And when you talk about getting down into the SMB space, I got a smart guy. He knows what he's doing. She's got this sorted out. I can guarantee you, no, they don't. So get help. Leverage third-party services. I think one of the best opportunities for companies who are concerned about this is to, there's nothing wrong with using a qualified MSSP. You should not be reading your firewall logs every night. Someone who knows what they're doing and who does it every day should be monitoring that for you. Bring in a third party. If you absolutely need a CISO, but you only need 10% of one, hire 10% of one. Don't not staff the role just because you're not big enough yet to have it. I think the opportunities are, look at the risks, try to bridge those gaps between the technical and the management, and don't be afraid to ask for help. The days of effectively managing this yourself are over.
Craig, I've had the pleasure or displeasure to found and manage and invest into startups. So for the startups here, I really do feel the burden. We have on our website, cybernationcentral.com, we've built it as a free resource for anybody from startups to public companies on what they should be thinking, how they should be thinking about the problem, etc. This is not a plug. It's just there are a lot of free resources out there. Go and they're pithy, to the point. Consume it so that you know what your decision matrix needs to include, and then you can make the right decisions as to what's necessary for your stage of the company.
Yeah, I think one of the there's a couple challenges that are out there, but I think there's a massive opportunity, right? I think the big challenge, and we've kind of hit on this, is just there is such a lack of cybersecurity talent. Like there's a huge shortage of that talent that's out there, right? And that's a really big problem that I think we need to address. And it starts at a layer that's much, down the stream than us, the supply chain stream than us. Two is, I think, just threat vectors are getting much more sophisticated. So we have to stay up with those. I think the proliferation of IoT and bring your own device, right, from a cost savings perspective. So now we don't just have Macs to secure. We got Macs, we've got Apples, or we've got Windows machines to secure out there. So there's a lot of challenge, and probably the biggest one in my environment is just regulatory complexity and the challenge of dealing with that. That is only increasing. We've got GDPR in EMEA. We're going to have a GDPR for every state here in the US, and it's crazy to try to keep up with that. And at the same time, I think there's some big opportunities, and it starts with technology, right? And AI and ML and what that will allow us to do with a whole host of things from threat detection to malware detection to process automation. Process automation, I think, is a huge advantage too, of like taking really amazingly technical individuals out of doing something that's a manual process and putting them onto a much more strategic opportunity within the organization, and let the technology do that, right? And then I think lastly, a big opportunity area here is just much more collaboration and threat intel sharing within the community, right? There's a lot of forms, there's a lot of ways to do this. And I think that's a big opportunity for the industry as a whole, is just sharing that threat intel that they're seeing with their peers in the market.
In fact, Matt, the way that we generally look at partnerships, just 3 partnerships that every CEO needs to be thinking about with their CISO. Government partnerships, industry partnerships, and an external cyber defense, cybersecurity partners like Jeff said. The help is out there. Now, to Matt's point, in terms of regulations, SEC is coming out with disclosure regulations for public companies. So for companies that are private on this webcast, that doesn't seem to be relevant yet. And yet, the Small and Medium Business Administration reached out to the SEC to start getting guidelines for SMB space on what they should be adopting from those rules and regulations. So that is coming your way. And as Matt said, because I come from a government background way back when, and the issue here is we at the United States congressional level cannot get our act together because of how our laws and regulations get passed and what the intrinsic conflicts of interest are to get what an EU or a China can have, which is a overarching cybersecurity policy that we've been at the country level trying to pass for years unsuccessfully. And so every state has had to take it into their own hands, as Matt said, to develop their own. Well, if your chief legal officer is looking at that, and God forbid you've got exposure to 50 states, all of a sudden your chief legal officer is dealing with 50 states' privacy laws, cybersecurity laws, etc. You're not able to consume all of that by yourself. So you do need that external help. So don't shy away from it. Have the right government partners, have the right cybersecurity partners, have the right industry partners, and take it from there.
Yeah, and you bring that up, that I don't think anybody sees this coming. First California and a couple other states, we're going to have 50 compliance regs if you want to do business in the United States, or how many states we have, sorry. That's insane. I mean, just GDPR in California alone, plus all the NIST shit, I'm going to have to create a cheat sheet for myself for the business I'm in, that where all these overlap. How can I comply with all of these with one control, right? It's not going to be one control, but like the firewall, what does it hit? How many of those does it hit?
Craig, you're getting right into operational compliance management, right? And to answer the question, I'll tell you exactly how you do it. You can start now, right? If you are not currently obligated to follow a specific regulatory requirement, you can still pick one that makes sense for your vertical and start doing the work, so that when you are required, you've got a head start. The biggest problem that we're seeing today in this entire ecosystem, let me tell you this much, companies that are already obligated and held to a standard typically aren't doing what they're already supposed to be doing. So if you're in a position as an organization that you get a head start because you don't have that obligation yet, now is the time, right? And yes, let's say there's 50 different standards. You can still pick a standard for your business, do the work to achieve that standard, and then a year from now, when you're told, here's what you have to do, guess what? You're 85% of the way there already because you picked a reasonable standard. Use a NIST CSF, use 800-171. If you need help, reach out. There are a host of qualified companies that can help you figure out what's the right standard for your business, how much of this are you potentially already doing, and how can you actually manage it effectively without having to stand up a whole compliance function. I mean, again, not a plug, that's what we do. There's all kinds of companies that can help you sort this out. But the biggest opportunity, frankly, is someone who is currently not obligated to reach a certain standard. That means you've got time to start, and you get a head start to do it right.
I'm going to start.
It's not rocket science, right? Start is the important message.
Yeah, I'm going to start a business just doing, compliance attestations for every state. No.
You would not be bored.
Craig, we already do that, so let's talk.
Oh, you do? Okay, never mind. It's done.
Yeah, and to Jeff's point, you're looking at not just laws and regulations, but you're looking at standards and frameworks. Then you're not just looking at standards, frameworks, laws, and regulations for your own state and whatever states you've got employees in, operations in, exposure in, because you've got third parties in, whatever the case is. You're then looking at your own specific industry, laws, regulations, standards, frameworks, then every other industry that might actually show you where the ball is going. So for example, the financial industry and obviously healthcare industries are good sort of leading indicators of where laws are going, because again, the average cost of breach is highest. And so if I'm a CEO or board chair in charge of the audit committee or risk committee, I am looking at those industries and seeing where is the ball going. That's a fiduciary hat that I need to be wearing.
And it's justified as a cost, because look at the companies who are doing this right, and it is a business differentiator for them. It's also a cost of doing business, but it is a differentiator.
Yeah, I'd say to Jeff's point, the real thing is if you start early, you don't have to retro go back and change a lot of things, right? And you can just put it in your code base. You can put it in your standard operating procedures. You can put it in the processes that you put in place into the organization. We actually have something that we call cross comply. So we put it in there, and it starts with the NIST CFF framework, but then you can map that framework to many different frameworks and standards, and then do one assessment to then comply with all the other ones. I would also advocate that at some point, and I've seen this a lot of times, what's the best tool in the world? Spreadsheets and emails, right? But it gets massively, massively unruly as you continue to grow and get bigger. So at some point in time, technology can really help operationalize and automate the tracking of the standards. What are we, systems, procedures, protocols do we have that comply with these standards? What gaps do we have? How are we going to fill those gaps? By when are we going to do that? And that's, again, the reporting level that then it just makes it very easy to be able to report up to the executive team and the board of where we are, when are we going to be at the next level, and then what will that unlock? Again, taking it all back to this is, at the end of the day, it's about the business. What will that unlock for the business as we're thinking about driving top line revenue for them?
Yeah, don't use spreadsheets. Don't use spreadsheets. I use spreadsheets for you. You don't have to use spreadsheets anymore. That's a huge take home from this. There are so many tools. If you want to get scared, go Google the secure controls framework cross-reference, and you'll basically find a master spreadsheet of every compliance framework everywhere cross-referenced. So the data exists. Managing it in spreadsheets is incredibly painful. There are better ways. Again, all kinds of companies can help. Matt can, we can, I'm sure Andrzej can too, right? If you need some help, reach out. I think that's another core message.
Absolutely.
Question from the field. You think there will ever be a point that LLMs, I think that's large language models, will be able to access company data? If so, what kind of security risks do you guys see? It's out of the blue. Sorry.
Well, I think that is a question that is the top of mind for every single CEO out there right now. If you're not in the AI business in the next 6 to 18 months, my opinion, you're out of business, right? There's two parts, and how we think about it is in two parts. What are we using internally from an AI perspective to help with efficiencies? How do I pre-populate my Salesforce for my callers? How do I get the list of customers that I want to make calls to that are the best for the potential next upsell opportunity or value creation opportunity that we can have, right? So there's a lot of things internally that AI is going to massively help with that you don't have, that you're not going to have the red tape of, I now am taking customers' data into this. That's a whole different ballgame, right? Because then you're going to have to deal with customers' policies, customers' procedures, customers' chain of custody from a data perspective. And these, especially if you're rolling your own LLM, it gets a little easier because then you can say, hey, this is the black box, this is how we've trained it, and give them some data on it. If you're using something like OpenAI, who knows where that data goes? Who knows what's in that, right? So what I predict will ultimately happen is there's going to be a breaking point where the efficiency gains are just so much and so great that they will overshadow and overpower the privacy, really their privacy concerns at the end of the day with the data. We are not there yet. And I think that the government hopefully will step in. I'm not too optimistic on this, and put in place a set of standards and regulations and privacy governance around using AI data and how that will work.
Yeah, then we're going to have a dark AI.
I mean, it's a real threat, right? It's a valid concern. I know in our space, our focus on AI is more still based on the traditional model of how do you control who gets into your network and your ecosystem with your endpoint security and your boundary and your perimeter management. So, I mean, in our space, we leverage AI more for better intel on rapid response to emerging threats. And there's been some huge growth just in the last 6 months to a year with, things like 0-day vulnerabilities getting exploited in the wild, and some of the better endpoint tools in the EDR and XDR space now more quickly recognizing and responding to those threats. So AI in our world today is more on the defensive posture side than the business enablement side.
And perhaps to add to Matt's point, I share his hope that government would implement regulations that streamline some of this. But if you're a CEO or a board chair looking at that as your saving grace, good luck. Regulations are always a lagging indicator. Hacker innovation curve is always going to be ahead. And with AI starting to slowly impact that equation on the hackers landscape as much as your own corporate landscape, you've got to be looking at it strategically. How do we use AI to, yes, as Matt said, operationally be better, but also how do we use AI from a CISO's perspective to start looking at where is cybercrime going, how can it take us ransom, etc., through AI methodologies, and take that calculus back to the drawing board of how to defend yourself.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, all good stuff. I think we're coming up on the hour. Can't thank you guys enough. I mean, there was an incredible insight offered today. If I run into a leader, and I ask them, hey, are you conscious of this? This would be a good cast to point them to, because it's kind of like you covered the bases on, look, everybody needs to do this. You're probably one of those that isn't. So, we need to get you plugged in, and to you guys mostly. So thanks. Thank you for attending. I'm grateful. And any last comments before we pull the plug?
Yeah, thanks for the time. Really appreciate it. Great discussion, gentlemen. Love the feedback. Just remember to use these powers for good and not evil.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And just remember, decentralize your cybersecurity. CISO as CEO of cyber is something that in the market has been the case. You may want to start thinking about decentralizing that CISO role across your leadership. Regulatory compliance versus tactical breach deterrence. Always think about those two. Regulatory compliance is not going to keep you breach deterrent. Only tactical tools will. And always culture of cybersecurity from the board down.
Awesome. All right, signing off. Thanks, gentlemen.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
3,
Bye.
2.